Summary of the life of Reverend David Brainerd, chiefly extracted from his diary by President Edwards, Chapter 6.
And for this deep dive, we're focusing on his diary from June 1744 to June 1745. The source material is all collected and organized by Jonathan Edwards.
Right.
And just a quick note, this summary is created with the help of AI, but it is instructed to stay very close to the chapter. And we're really about to immerse ourselves in what was an exceptionally difficult period of his missionary work.
Yeah, our mission today is really to unpack a year that just tests the absolute limits of human endurance, both spiritually and physically. We're looking at Brainerd's renewed labors among the Indians at and near the forks of Delaware. And we're going to focus on his intense physical weakness, his internal wrestling with discouragement, the challenges of open idolatry, and these just brutal wilderness journeys.
I think this chapter, maybe more than any other, is the ultimate case study in what it means to rely on providence. What stands out immediately, and Edwards noted this in his compilation, is the almost impossible contrast between the spiritual goal, the conversion of a seemingly immovable population, and just the frailty of the man doing it.
He was a man perpetually on the verge of collapse.
Exactly. And yet, he saw his work proceed only because, as he believed, the living God was engaged in it. So we have to look at these moments not just as events, but as high-stakes spiritual transactions.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start with his return to the field. He had just taken a very brief break, and immediately upon heading back, the physical trials just resume with a vengeance.
The journey back, which took him 3 days, is immediately defined by that physical frailty. Brainerd writes in his diary, "The road was accomplished under much weakness of body.
And yet
I found comfort in my soul from day to day." And that's it right there. That's the core dialectic of his life. Constant debilitating illness right next to this unwavering spiritual resolve.
it's so important for you, the listener, to understand that this weakness wasn't like a temporary cold. This was his baseline. And it dictates the intensity of his internal life. If your body's always failing, your spirit has no choice but to find a supernatural source of strength. This is perfectly encapsulated in his experience on the Lord's Day, June 24th.
Yes, he notes being, and this is his own words, extremely feeble, scarcely able to walk. But despite this, he forces himself out to visit the Indians, and he specifically focuses on those who were profoundly disaffected toward Christianity.
So this wasn't a simple Sunday sermon.
Not at all. It was a direct confrontation with skepticism while he could barely even stand up.
And the insight here is what he does while he's speaking. He describes his whole dependence and hope of success seemed to be on God, and that he was relying on silent requests even while speaking. He's doing two things at once.
Right.
He's delivering the external message and waging this internal war of intercession. It's a total recognition that his own rhetoric, by itself, is useless.
That internal reality, that constant silent pleading during the physical act of preaching, that is a key insight into his ministry. It shows a man who completely bypasses any reliance on his own eloquence or education or effort.
He knew that conversion was a miracle, not a persuasion.
Yes, and therefore it required constant, immediate divine input.
And the human outlook, the view from the ground was just bleak. On June 25th and 26th, he's wrestling with the crushing impossibility of it all. He concludes that to an eye of reason, everything that respects the conversion of the heathen is as dark as midnight.
The resistance was immense. You have deep cultural roots, fear, a lack of any shared religious framework. The whole mission must have looked like a fool's errand.
So this is where his theology gives him the leverage, right?
Exactly. When the immediate reality is impossibly dark, he shifts his focus to the historical faithfulness of God. Edwards makes a point to highlight that Brainerd found his strength in the Old Testament, specifically in the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
He looked at the trials that Nehemiah and Ezra faced, and he observed the wonderful assistance God afforded his servants in reforming his people.
And that historical perspective, it shifts his outlook completely. It leads to that incredible conclusion. The work would proceed because the living God, as I strongly hoped, was engaged for it. That one conviction just outweighs all the logical evidence to the contrary.
It's a remarkable transition from, rational despair to this confident faith.
But we have to remember the practical grind of it. The next day he spends translating prayers into the Delaware language, and it's an exceedingly difficult task because his interpreter was altogether unacquainted with the business.
Right. This isn't just a language barrier. It's a failure to bridge entire conceptual worlds. How do you translate concepts like sanctification, atonement, or redemption when the linguistic structure just doesn't have equivalents?
And yet, even in that grueling, frustrating technical work, he finds spiritual support. He says, God supported me, and especially in the evening, gave me sweet refreshment. He found this enlargement in prayer despite the exhaustion of the day.
This brings us to a foundational concept in Brainerd's whole spirituality. Right. Self-renunciation.
Yes. On June 28th, while he's praying in the woods, he pleads that the cause was not mine, but that it was his own cause. And that's it. That's the critical moment of theological commitment that underpins the entire mission.
And why is that so crucial for a figure like Brainerd, who is so steeped in Puritan theology?
Because for him, the purity of the motivation determines the efficacy of the work.
He explicitly says he felt no desire of their conversion, that I might receive honor from the world as being the instrument of it.
And this is so much more than just modesty. This is a terrifyingly high standard of Puritan piety. If he derived any personal satisfaction or reputation, any honor from the world, from the converts, then the work would be polluted.
So by giving up all personal claim, he's essentially forcing the responsibility and the glory back onto God.
It's an administrative move in the spiritual economy, you could say. It ensures that God is the sole benefactor of any success.
And this whole commitment just culminates on July 1st. He starts the day preaching without any heart or power. But in the afternoon, something shifts dramatically.
He finds a spirit of love and warmth and power to plead with them.
And he witnesses the greatest response he's seen yet. I never saw such a tension raised in them. It was the immediate, visible fruit of that absolute dedication 3 days prior.
And the physical aftermath of this dedication is just astounding. It connects directly to this idea of the body sort of dissolving under spiritual strain. As he's riding home, he rededicates himself without any exception or reserve. But the cost is immediate.
He notes, my fingers grew very feeble and somewhat numb. My joints seemed all to be loosed, but I felt abundant strength in the inner man, the sheer intensity of the spiritual act, that profound self-surrender. It literally overrode and temporarily incapacitated his physical nature.
The body becomes the sacrificial vessel for the interior strength. And this initial dedication really sets the stage for the tremendous battles to follow, where this contrast between physical failure and spiritual fire becomes the main narrative.
The first observable shift in his desires happens early in July. Before, he was always yearning for heaven just to escape this world and find some personal rest.
Right.
But now, his focus becomes purely about external utility.
On July 6th, he has this realization: all my concern almost is for the conversion of the heathen, and for that end I long to live. He's no longer seeking ease in eternity, he's seeking effectiveness in the present.
He longs for holiness so that he might become an able minister of the New Testament to the heathen. It's a move from, anxiety about his own salvation to anxiety for the mission.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because Brainerd's deepest longing for usefulness immediately collides with the darkest reality of the field: active, organized, spiritual opposition.
That opposition comes on July 21st. He hears news that the Indians are planning an idolatrous feast and dance for the next day.
And this wasn't just a cultural event for him. It was a religious rite, an act of overt communal worship directed toward beings Brainerd identified as devils.
His response is one of total anguish. He felt he must, in conscience, go and endeavor to break them up, yet knew not how to attempt such a thing. He knew a physical confrontation would be useless. The battle had to be won somewhere else.
And this leads to the most famous and maybe the most physically harrowing prayer episode in the whole diary. Edwards makes sure to quote this extensively, highlighting the physical cost of the spiritual importunity.
Brainerd describes being exceedingly enlarged in prayer. The anguish and the pleading were so intense that his physical body just broke down. He says in this quote is just, wow, I felt extremely weak and overcome. I could scarcely walk straight. My joints were loosed. The sweat ran down my face and body, and nature seemed as if it would dissolve.
We really have to pause there. We're dealing with an intense emotional and psychological phenomenon. Modern psychology might point toward, elements of extreme stress, sensory overload, maybe even a form of acute anxiety attack, given his already frail state.
Right.
But in the 18th century spiritual framework, especially during the Great Awakening, this physical dissolution was interpreted as the verifiable sign of genuine spiritual warfare. That the soul was wrestling so intensely with powers unseen that the physical frame just couldn't contain the effort.
And the key is that the focus was entirely external. He knew that they were met together to worship devils, and he pleaded earnestly for God to vindicate his own cause. The result was absolute detachment from the world.
Edwards really emphasizes how Brainerd's worldly desires just vanished. He says, "All things here below vanished. All my cares, fears, and desires disappeared, and were in my esteem of little more importance than a puff of wind."
That's the successful outcome of the prayer. The complete psychological and emotional evacuation of all earthly ambition, fear, or comfort. The only things left were holiness of heart and life, and the conversion of the heathen to God.
Yet the visible outcome the next day, July 22nd, was devastating for him.
He did successfully persuade the Indians to stop their frolic and attend his preaching, which was a minor victory. But, he lamented, he saw nothing of the special power of God among them.
A night of soul-rending, body-breaking prayer, resulting in 0 conversions. This non-result led immediately to the counterattack, which wasn't physical, but intellectual and spiritual. The temptation to despair.
And the temptations were brutal. He faced the doubt. There is no God, or if there be, he is not able to convert the Indians before they have more knowledge, etc.
The devil is essentially throwing rational doubt back at him. You can't succeed until they're intellectually ready. Your mission is a failure.
But his determination was just unbent. He was determined still to wait upon God for the conversion of the heathen.
This persistence against discouragement really highlights the immense psychological cost of living in such isolation and spiritual intensity. By August 5th, the constant pressure and lack of fruit lead him to this powerful, desperate metaphor.
He writes, "I seem to myself like a man that has all his estate embarked in one small boat, unhappily going adrift down a swift torrent." This image, it just speaks to total existential loss. All his investment, his life's meaning is in that boat, and it's slipping away. And all he can do is watch and lament.
But here's the twist. Lamenting, or giving way to despair, actually aggravates his bodily disorders. So what does a man of such high spiritual intensity do when he's physically incapable of working and emotionally incapable of despairing?
He is forced to divert myself with trifles, even though he feels guilt over the misimprovement of time. This is a crucial window into his self-imposed requirements. Brainerd views simple, necessary rest or mental relief as a moral failing because it's not directly contributing to the glory of God.
The physical weakness creates a crisis of utility for him. It's a heartbreaking position to be in. Too weak to work, yet too spiritually zealous to rest without feeling guilty. He longs for God to pity his distressed state, purely so that he can get back to effective labor.
Following that acute crisis, Brainerd enters a period of slightly less intense illness.
Right. Edwards notes that for the next 3 weeks, his illness lessened, which allowed him to perform some public duty. His great longings for the enlargement of Christ's kingdom continued, defining his entire outlook. What's fascinating, though, is that his immense hope is balanced by this constant self-critique. He still sees himself as a vilest creature on earth.
That dual perception, absolute confidence in God's mission, absolute unworthiness in himself, that's the key to his sustained zeal, isn't it?
It is. This unworthiness compels him forward because he believes that only a powerful God could use such a weak instrument. And this theme comes to a head in September when he confronts the specific spiritual opposition of the powers.
On September 2nd, he's preaching with a lot of fervency, and he realizes that some of the Indians were terrified of converting, lest they should be enchanted and poisoned by some of the powwows. We should probably stop and clarify that term for our listeners.
Good idea. The powwows were the traditional spiritual leaders, shamans, or medicine men of the indigenous tribes. Their authority was based on their claimed ability to communicate with spirits, heal, or crucially, inflict harm through magic or poison.
So this was a very real, tangible threat to the Indians. It was far more immediate than theological arguments.
And Brainerd understands this fear must be broken by a direct demonstration of superior power. He notes that the honor of God was concerned, not just the safety of the converts.
Exactly. So he confronts the fear head-on. He pleads with the Indians not to fear these dark powers. And then, in this moment of just extraordinary confidence, he issues a challenge.
He says, "I bid a challenge to all these powers of darkness to do their worst on me first." And he points out that he's a Christian and he's unharmed.
That act of public vindication was strategically essential.
Absolutely. It provided immediate practical evidence that the Christian God was capable of preserving his followers against the very real dangers that the powers represented. It shifted the spiritual power balance in the Indians' eyes.
And to give our listeners the full picture of the monumental task Brainerd faced, Edwards includes an excerpt from a letter Brainerd wrote to a Reverend Mr. Pemberton, outlining 5 comprehensive obstacles to Christianization.
Okay, so first, the most demoralizing obstacle. Prejudices instilled by the vicious lives and unchristian behavior of some that are called Christians.
The white colonial stumbling block.
Exactly. These settlers actively discouraged conversion. They feared a loss of unlawful gain through trade or exploitation if the Indians adopted Christian morality. So the greatest opposition was coming not from the heathen, but from so-called Christians.
Wow. Okay, second.
Second, the inertia of tradition. The Indians were anchored in this belief that it was not the same God made them who made the white people. Their default response was, we will live as our fathers lived and go to their fathers when we die.
A deep cultural and historical attachment that trumps any abstract theological argument.
Third, persistent idolatry. Their reliance on feasts and sacrifices offered to unknown beings who spoke in dreams, promising success in hunting. These rites were woven into the fabric of their material survival. So adopting Christianity meant a total economic and social uprooting.
And fourth was the pervasive fear of the palace, which he publicly challenged, but which was still a constant internal deterrent for many.
And finally, the difficulty presented by their roving lifestyle. Their continual movement from place to place just prevented consistent, prolonged instruction, the antithesis of the stable, systematic preaching Brainerd valued.
These 5 factors really illustrate why he felt the mission was as dark as midnight. It was a simultaneous attack on deeply held spiritual beliefs, economic reliance, cultural identity, and physical security.
Yet in September, after traveling over 420 miles on a journey to New England and back, he noted a temporary recovery of health.
On September 26th, he thanks God for preserving him in riding over 420 miles, observing that his health was likewise greatly recovered. And he immediately dedicates this recovered strength back to God, saying, "Oh, that I could dedicate my all to God. This is all the return I can make to him."
The restored body is instantly mortgaged back to the cause.
And that temporary health was immediately tested by his next major undertaking, the journey to the Susquehanna region, undertaken in early October.
He set out with dear brother Byram and 2 chief Indians, knowing they were entering a hideous and howling wilderness. This journey was strategically crucial. The Susquehanna tribes were further west, less influenced by colonial settlements, and they represented a major, untouched demographic.
He knew he had to reach these people regardless of the physical toll.
And the toll began immediately. On October 3rd, they encountered lofty mountains, deep valleys, and hideous rocks. This wasn't just a rough road, it was dangerous, untamed territory. And then the accident happened.
The traumatic loss of the horse. It broke its leg in the rocks, and Brainerd had to kill it.
They were nearly 30 miles from any human habitation. In the 18th century, losing your horse in the deep wilderness means losing mobility, carrying capacity, and a massive safety margin. It instantly became a survival test.
They pushed on, traveling on foot. And that night, they kindled a fire, cut up a few bushes, and made a shelter over our heads to save us from the frost. And he says they slept quietly on the ground after committing themselves to God.
The contrast there is just palpable. Minutes after having his essential means of transport destroyed and facing near hypothermia, he reports sleeping quietly. It shows the power of that earlier self-renunciation. Physical safety had truly become secondary to the spiritual mission.
By October 5th, they reached Opaholhelpon. Brainerd preached, and the Indians, somewhat surprisingly, agreed to hear him again.
But despite the physical trauma of the journey, Brainerd was immediately aware of the impossibility of success without special assistance from above. The pressure was on to secure their attention before their roving lifestyle took over again.
So on October 6th, he goes house to house, persuading them to delay their hunting trip, which was a massive disruption to their seasonal economy. He spent over an hour in secret retirement that night, praying for ministerial endowments and for success.
And the effort paid off, at least temporarily. On October 8th, the Indians, beyond expectation, desired to hear him preach again before they left. This small sign of openness, following such a grueling effort, must have fueled his resolve.
The return journey, however, was another ordeal. Rising at 4 a.m., they traveled until after 6 p.m., sleeping outside, with the wolves howling around us.
The elements, the wilderness, the cold, the predators were constantly pressing in, mirroring the spiritual darkness he was fighting.
His final reflection on October 12th is so telling. He notes that God marvelously and almost miraculously supported me under the fatigues of the way and traveling on foot. He doesn't credit his own stamina. He credits a divine intervention necessary to keep a man who was usually extremely feeble, walking 30 miles through hideous terrain.
After returning from the Susquehanna journey, Brainerd settles back into his solitary routine at the forks of Delaware. Having confronted the external world, His diary now turns inward, focusing on this relentless quest for spiritual perfection, what we might call angelic utility.
On October 24th, he notes that he was unable to preach in a close and distinguishing manner, meaning he preached critically, challenging and testing the spiritual state of his hearers, making it impossible for them to hide behind simple outward forms of piety.
And that evening, his prayer was for himself. He truly longed to be as lively myself in God's service as the angels.
And that's a crucial concept, isn't it? Angels in Protestant theology serve God perfectly, without fatigue, error, or selfish motive.
Exactly. Brainerd's goal isn't merely to be saved, but to maximize his usefulness to God by achieving that level of tireless, pure service.
And this longing for holiness, he clarifies, is entirely selfless. On October 26, he says, "I longed for holiness more for this end than I did for my own happiness' sake." His greatest joy was never more to dishonor, but always to glorify the blessed God.
His personal happiness is a byproduct of God's glory, never the primary goal. Yet this extremely high standard inevitably leads to profound self-criticism. When he senses a drop in his spiritual zeal, the contrast between the ideal angelic service and the reality of frail humanity is unbearable.
By October 31st, this spiritual despair just sets in. He is sensible of my barrenness and decays. This leads to that famous cry for release. "Oh, death, death, my kind friend, hasten and deliver me from dull mortality and make me spiritual and vigorous to eternity."
Calling death a kind friend sounds so morbid to a modern ear, but theologically, for Brainerd, it makes perfect sense. His greatest sin, in his own view, was his dullness and barrenness, his inability to utilize every moment for God's glory.
So death for him was the instant, total cure for this uselessness. It was the pathway to perfect continuous spiritual service. The burden he felt was, "I seem to live for nothing and to do no good, and oh, the burden of such a life."
The physical world continued to reinforce his detachment. In November, he gets lost while traveling in the cold, wandering over hideous steeps, through swamps and most dreadful and dangerous places. He uses these physical sufferings therapeutically.
He says these hardships serve to wean me from the earth. He stops having illusions that it will be better hereafter in this life. He expects tribulation, the cold, the pain, the isolation. All of it confirms that this world is not his home.
Which is the positive function of hardship in his spiritual life.
By December 4th, he has successfully built his little cottage or hut to live in by himself through the winter. This act of establishing a stable base should be a positive step, but the spiritual reality immediately undercuts it.
He instantly sinks into discouragement upon seeing the Indians going to another idolatrous feast, despite all his efforts. This combination of spiritual deadness, the sight of his people actively worshiping devils, and the sense of overwhelming failure pushes him to take radical action.
He dedicates December 6th to secret fasting and prayer. The motivation is clear. His extreme barrenness, spiritual deadness, the scale of his work, and the fact that his poor Indians are now worshiping devils.
And this self-examination is brutally intense. He receives a clear conviction of my sinfulness. He realizes that when God withdrew, he was vulnerable to sinful dispositions. And one of them was despair, being unsuitably desirous of death out of a despair of doing good.
Wait a minute, he just called death his kind friend a few weeks earlier. Now he's labeling a desire for death a sin.
Exactly. It shows the nuance in his self-critique. Desiring death because you long to glorify God perfectly, that's angelic utility, that's righteous. But desiring death because you've given up hope in God's ability to use you in this life, that's despair, and that's sinful. He realized his earlier longing for death may have edged toward despair.
His self-loathing at this moment is extreme. He uses these powerful period metaphors. His heart seemed like a nest of vipers or a cage of unclean and hateful birds.
That's standard Puritan language for total depravity, needing to be purified by the blood of sprinkling, which is a reference to Christ's atoning blood.
But the day of fasting doesn't end in self-loathing. It ends in one of the most sublime acts of theological resignation, finding joy in something entirely external to himself or his mission.
Toward night, he notes, I felt my soul rejoice that God is unchangeably happy and glorious and that he will be glorified whatever becomes of his creatures.
That is the pinnacle of his spiritual wrestling.
It is. It means whether Brainerd lives or dies, whether the mission succeeds or fails, whether the Indians convert or remain idolatrous, none of it affects the ultimate perfect glory and happiness of God. His joy is now founded in God's unchangeable nature, a rock that cannot be affected by Brainerd's frail body or his unsuccessful ministry. This allowed him to persevere in prayer, forgetting his need for food until late in the evening.
And the breakthrough, however small, followed soon after this intense period of self-renunciation. On December 12th, he found his interpreter under some concern for his soul.
This was a comfort, but also critically new care. This is a turning point. Up until this moment, the interpreter had been a linguistic necessity, but spiritually disconnected. Now, he is a potential spiritual ally.
So this gives Brainerd an indigenous, motivated voice to convey the subtle, spiritual urgency of his message, which had previously been hampered by technical translation issues.
And the breakthrough came 6 days later, on December 18th. He starts his sermon without any power, but then finds some fervency. And crucially, his interpreter was amazingly assisted in translating, suggesting the interpreter's own newfound spiritual understanding imbued the message with power.
The result was instantaneous and visible. Most of the grown persons were much affected, and the tears ran down their cheeks, including one old man, supposedly 100 years old.
This is the first sustained, observable fruit of his 2 years of agonizing labor, a clear vindication of his conviction that God was engaged for the work.
This success immediately fueled his capacity for prayer. On December 19th and 21st, he spent a great part of the day praying for the Spirit on his people and his interpreter, finding it sweet to rest and hope in God.
The hope was now based on visible evidence, not just theological conviction. Even physical suffering was transformed. On Christmas Day, December 25th, bodily weakness interrupts his sleep and study. But his heart was lively in prayer, and he was once again delighted with the divine glory and happiness and rejoiced that God was God.
That foundational truth from the day of fasting remains his source of contentment.
By early 1745, the gloom had entirely lifted. On January 9th, he felt quite willing to live and undergo all trials, though he still longed for heaven, but now only to glorify God in a perfect manner. The focus shifts back to willing endurance for the sake of utility in this world.
This renewed willingness to live is immediately contrasted by a stark encounter with death itself. On February 11th, he visits a man who has just died, finding him speechless and senseless. This triggers a powerful meditation.
He writes, "I know not that ever death appeared more real to me, or that ever I saw myself in the condition of a dead corpse, so evidently as at this time." This is an abstract fear. It's a terrifyingly vivid visualization of his own mortality.
But the result is profound peace. He was exceedingly tranquil, my mind was composed and calm, and death appeared without a sting.
And this tranquility stems from what he calls universal mortification to all created objects.
We should probably define mortification here for our audience. In this context, it doesn't mean shame or embarrassment, right?
No, not at all. It means the dying of the self, specifically the suppression or extinguishing of all sinful desires and attachments to the world. It's total detachment.
He views riches, honors, and pleasures as vain and trifling. He could see himself dead, in the coffin, and in the grave, without terror.
Because his ultimate joy was already anchored in God's unchangeable glory, the temporary loss of all earthly possessions, including his own life, held no terror. He was already, in a sense, emotionally and spiritually buried.
This brings us to his journey back to New England, starting March 21st, which highlights the administrative reality of his mission.
Right. Edwards notes the purpose. It was to raise some money among Christian friends in order to support a colleague with me in the wilderness.
He had spent 2 years in a very solitary manner.
And this wasn't merely a preference. It was a physical and strategic necessity to seek companionship. The workload was unsustainable, the isolation was crushing. He needed a partner for both physical survival and ministerial efficiency, which reflects the biblical model of sending out disciples 2 by 2.
He returned on April 13th, having ridden 600 miles. And despite the success of the revival and the financial necessity of the trip, he reflects on the lack of true spiritual connection he encountered on the road.
On April 26th, he notes that he finds few with whom he can talk religion itself, though many can talk about religion. He prefers those who love to feed on the kernel rather than the shell.
That's a subtle but powerful critique of, formal external Christianity versus genuine interior piety. He was seeking deep spiritual communion, which was exceedingly rare.
This intense internal life also forced him to confront the need for rest. On April 30th, he was so weak he had to stay in bed, unable to read, meditate, or pray. He recognized it as his duty to divert myself by all lawful means to regain fitness for labor.
Which is a sophisticated spiritual analysis of lawful diversion.
It is. He distinguishes between his former life, where he made a god of my diversions, delighting in them for their own sake, and his current state. where he uses them as means to help me in living to God. The motive has shifted entirely.
So diversion isn't pleasure. It's a tool for greater utility. It's a means to an end, with God remaining the ultimate source of satisfaction.
Exactly. But the ultimate physical test was yet to come. Following a brief spiritual high point where he longed to preach the truth of Psalm 17:15, I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness, he set out on his second devastating journey to the Susquehanna on May 8th.
He was already weak. He lodged one night in the open woods. Then fate just conspired against him. He was overtaken by a northeasterly storm, unable to make a fire. But the real calamity was the horses.
The horses ate poison and became so sick they couldn't be ridden or led. They were forced to travel on foot, near perishing until they found a bark hut. The broken horse in the autumn was bad. This was total biological failure across the whole party in the spring.
Edwards emphasizes that this mission, traveling 100 miles on the river and visiting 7 or 8 tribes, was marked by constant discouragement and weeks of sleeping on the ground. He was pushing his body past the breaking point for minimal visible success.
And it nearly killed him. After a fortnight, he was seized with an ague, fever, extreme pains, and a severe internal hemorrhage, a great evacuation of blood. He thought he was going to perish in the wilderness.
He was fortunate to reach an Indian trader's hut, where he recovered just enough strength, after about a week, to ride home. He arrived back at the Forks of Delaware on May 30th, having ridden 340 miles in a state of extreme physical weakness and dejection of mind. He had hit rock bottom.
Miraculously, the physical nadir was instantly followed by spiritual refreshment. On June 5th, despite his fatigue, he found thirsting desires after God and a sweet season of meditation on that passage he cherished. I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness.
His mind was clear, his soul refreshed. He longed for more of God's likeness, seeing it as the ultimate blessedness. And this internal centering, following the near-death experience, perfectly prepared him for the great public outpouring that was about to occur.
This took place June 8th through 10th at Mr. Beatty's meeting house at Neshaminy. Though exhausted, he preached to a crowded audience from Isaiah 40.1, and it was a sweet, melting season in the assembly.
The real power, however, manifested on Lord's Day, June 9th, during the communion service. Brainerd spoke, extemper off the cuff on the text, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him.
He says, God gave him great assistance, and the word was attended with amazing power. The scale of the revival was vast. Many scores, if not hundreds, in that great assembly, consisting of 3,000 or 4,000, were much affected, so that there was a very great mourning, like the mourning of Hadadrimmon.
Okay, so that specific biblical allusion, the mourning of Hadadrimmon, we have to provide some context for that.
We do. This is a reference from the book of Zechariah, and it describes a type of lamentation so deep and pervasive, it was associated with the profoundest national and spiritual grief in ancient Israel. By using this phrase, Edwards and Brainerd are emphasizing that the emotional impact of the revival was total, a massive, public display of conviction and repentance.
And what's fascinating is the contrast. Just a year earlier, Brainerd was physically dissolving in prayer, begging God to break up one small idolatrous feast.
Right.
Now that solitary, agonizing labor culminates in a massive, public, undeniable outpouring of the Spirit on 3,000 or 4,000 people. The success is exponentially greater than the immediate focus of his struggle.
That solitary endurance and self-renunciation laid the groundwork for this public harvest. He found simple, human joy on June 11th, spending the day with dear Christian friends, whom I call the excellent ones of the earth, in whom is all my delight. After years of solitary, physical, and spiritual warfare, the value of true community is just immense.
And with that spiritual zenith achieved, the chapter closes. On June 18th, Brainerd sets out from New Brunswick to visit the Indians at Crossweeksung in New Jersey. This transition signifies the close of his primary mission among the Delaware Forks Indians and moves him toward a new and ultimately even more fruitful chapter of ministry.
So as we conclude this deep dive into Chapter 6, we are left with this undeniable impression of an individual whose life was a contradiction, a physically failing man who was spiritually indestructible.
The mission, in his own words, appeared as dark as midnight.
Yet he was sustained by the absolute conviction that the living God was personally engaged for the success of the work.
What Brainerd teaches us is the ultimate cost of what he called utility. He lived by the principle that if he wasn't perfectly glorifying God, he was failing, and that this failure justified the longing for death as a kind friend.
His self-denial wasn't about asceticism for its own sake, but about ensuring his work was entirely unpolluted by worldly ambition.
So we ask you, the listener, to consider this radical commitment. Brainerd felt immense guilt for diverting himself with trifles, even when his body needed rest, because it meant a misimprovement of time that could have been used to glorify God. How did the intensity of that self-renunciation, where every moment must be maximized for spiritual service, stand in contrast to our modern standards of work-life balance, comfort, and the constant search for personal happiness?
His life forces us to question the purity of our own motivation and the true depth of our dedication. Is our greatest concern for ourselves, or for the objective glory of something outside of ourselves? It is a provocative thought that builds on his entire agonizing journey.
A profound challenge indeed. If you found this deep dive into the intense life and unwavering faith of David Brainerd illuminating, make sure you subscribe.
We will continue to unpack transformative historical accounts and bring you the kernel, rather than the shell, of critical knowledge and insight.
Don't miss the next deep dive. We'll be waiting.